So, usually when we talk about like a political revolution, there's this expectation of a single climactic movie-like event.
Right, like the big finale.
Exactly. A regime falling, statues coming down, crowds cheering in the square. It feels like the finish line for everyone watching.
It does feel like the end of the story. But when you step into the actual world of like geopolitical transitions and state building, you realize that climactic moment isn't the finish line at all.
Yeah.
It's basically barely the starting pistol.
The real danger, the part that actually determines the fate of millions of people, is what happens the day after.
Exactly. The morning after the statues fall.
Right. Like, how do you stop a state from just collapsing into this massive security vacuum once the old rules are completely gone?
Which is incredibly hard to do.
It is. And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We are unpacking the highly complex, incredibly high-stakes blueprint for managing a democratic transition in Iran. Specifically, the mechanics of shifting from a deeply entrenched authoritarian regime to a representative governance.
And, for you listening, it's vital to understand why this matters. Political transitions are historically perilous. I mean, a poorly managed transition doesn't just mean a few bad years of economic downturn.
Right. It's a lot worse than that.
Far worse. It frequently leads to complete state failure or, an authoritarian relapse. And a collapse in a nation of that size, situated right in the Middle East, that sends massive ripple effects through the global economy, energy markets, and international security.
Oh, absolutely. And really quickly, it's important to note for you listening that our goal here isn't to take a political stance or endorse a specific outcome.
Right. No sides here.
Exactly. We are just acting as your guides, neutrally mapping out the exact geopolitical architecture that the researchers, sociologists, and policy analysts in our sources have proposed. We're just looking at these frameworks objectively.
Just reading the blueprints.
Yes. So let's look at the anatomy of the obstacle, because to dismantle or, transform a system, you first have to understand its exact architecture. So what are we actually dealing with when we look at the Iranian state?
Well, if you look at the architecture of the state, it operates as what's called a hybrid regime.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
It means it isn't a straightforward military dictatorship in the traditional sense. It utilizes democratic facades like holding regular elections, having a parliament called the Majlis, and a presidency.
Right, the stuff that makes it look like a democracy on paper.
Exactly,
Yeah.
But it uses those to mask an underlying theocratic absolutism. And this entire structure revolves around a very specific religious and legal doctrine called velayat-e-faqih.
Which translates to the guardianship of the jurist, right?
Right.
Let's break down how that actually functions for the listener. Why a jurist?
So the underlying theory argues that an Islamic jurist is the only figure qualified to interpret divine law and basically govern society until the return of the Mahdi, which is a messianic figure in Shia Islam.
Wow, okay, so it's not just a political title.
Not at all. Because of this, the supreme leader isn't just the political head of state. He is viewed as having a literal divine mandate. Challenging him isn't just treason structurally, it's treated as heresy.
That is a massive distinction.
It really is. It gives the supreme leader the ultimate veto over everything. I mean, he controls the armed forces, foreign policy, the judiciary, all of it.
And the mechanism of control gets even more, granular when you look at the Guardian Council. Right?
Oh, yeah. The Guardian Council is key.
Because this is an unelected body of 12 clerics and jurists, and they act as the ultimate gatekeepers.
Right, they vet everyone.
Exactly. They vet and disqualify any political candidate who might pose a genuine threat to the status quo. So the elected institutions end up acting as a pressure valve for the public.
A veneer of participation.
Right. But the actual power remains permanently locked at the top.
But, and this is crucial, that hybrid structure is not static. A critical reality in the current analysis is that the regime is actually undergoing a massive internal shift right now.
The sources called it an evolutionary regime change, right?
Yes. The traditional clerical establishment is basically gradually being pushed down the ladder, subordinated to the military, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or the IRGC.
It's essentially a corporate shell game.
That's a great way to put it.
Right, because you have the clerics acting as the public-facing board of directors. They give the sermons, hold the ceremonial authority, take all the public blame.
Yeah, they're the face of the company.
But behind the scenes, the security apparatus is the aggressive CEO, quietly buying up all the stock, taking over the shadow state economy and basically monopolizing all the real decision-making power.
And to understand how that actually happened, you really have to look at the mechanics of the last 2 decades. After the Iran-Iraq War and especially following the massive Green Movement protests in 2009.
Oh, right, the Green Movement.
Yeah, the clerical state basically realized it needed a heavy hand to maintain control. So the IRGC provided the muscle to crush domestic dissent.
But they didn't do it for free,
Okay.
obviously.
In exchange for their loyalty and enforcement, they were rewarded with massive state contracts. We're talking control of major ports, telecommunications infrastructure.
Wow.
Yeah, they basically mutated from a defensive ideological militia into the single most powerful economic and military institution in the country.
Which introduces a major institutional vulnerability into the picture. Because Iran doesn't just have one military, it actually has 2 parallel military.
Right, which is highly unusual.
Yeah, you have the IRGC, which is highly ideological and increasingly dominant, but you also have the regular armed forces, which are known as the Artesh.
The traditional military, they actually predate the 1979 revolution.
Right, and the Artesh is historically tasked with defending the country's borders, whereas the IRGC is explicitly tasked with defending the revolution itself.
Meaning internal control.
Exactly, internal suppression. And any successful democratic transition relies heavily on exploiting this very specific institutional rift.
Right, because if the IRGC tries to completely consume the political and economic system, they run the massive risk of alienating the Artesh.
Which opens a window.
It does. Gaining the buy-in, or at least the neutrality of the Artesh, is a foundational requirement in these blueprints to prevent the IRGC from just fully dominating a post-transition scenario.
Okay, so if the state is locking down its power militarily with this heavily armed CEO at the helm, where is the momentum for a democratic transition actually coming from?
Well, it's coming from the ground up.
Right. It seems to be rooted in the changing fabric of Iranian society itself. The demographic shifts are just staggering when you look at the sources. 70% of the population is from the post-revolutionary generation.
They have no memory of 1979.
None.
No.
They don't have that ideological attachment.
Hey.
And over 61% of undergraduate students are women.
Which is a massive catalyst for change, because that fundamentally alters the paternalistic structure of the Iranian family. And by extension, it completely challenges the paternalistic structure of the state.
Because they're educated but held back.
Exactly. When you educate millions of women but legally lock them out of equal participation in the workforce and society, you basically create an immense societal pressure cooker.
And we saw that pressure cooker explode with the woman life freedom movement.
Brilliant.
It represents an unprecedented national resistance. And it was initiated by women and marginalized groups. It shifted the demand from mere political reforms, like tweaking the mandatory veiling laws, to a full demand for total self-determination.
It's a completely different level of protest.
But let me play devil's advocate here, because I'm sure you listening might be wondering the exact same thing. If 70% of the country wants change, and there is immense, crushing economic misery across the board, why doesn't a democratic transition just happen overnight?
Right. Why hasn't it worked yet?
Yeah. Why doesn't the sheer weight of numbers break the system immediately?
Well, that is the essential question. And the answer lies in the mechanics of everyday life under what economists call a rentier system.
A rentier system. Break that down for us.
So a rentier state derives all or a substantial portion of its national revenues from the rent of indigenous resources to external clients. In Iran's case, that's oil.
Right.
Because the government gets its money from oil exports rather than taxing its citizens. The old adage, no taxation without representation, basically gets flipped on its head.
Oh, wow. Because if they don't need your taxes, they don't need your input.
Exactly. They don't rely on the population for revenue.
And they use that oil wealth to just engineer dependency.
They do. The state doesn't just use guns to control the population. It uses access to basic survival. They force citizens to rely on state-granted privileges just to achieve any sort of social mobility.
But what kind of privileges?
Well, consider a high school student. They might join the Basish, which is the paramilitary militia controlled by the IRGC, not out of deep ideological belief, but just to gain preferential quotas for university entrance exams.
Oh, I see. Or to fast-track a public sector job?
Exactly. You essentially collect rentier points just to survive.
Wow. And this creates a demographic of what the sociologists in our sources call the middle-class poor. You have highly educated people, engineers, teachers, nurses who are driving taxis or working 3 jobs just to keep up with hyperinflation.
Right. And that exhausting daily grind of working 3 jobs drastically shrinks a population's time horizon.
Oh, time horizon.
Yeah. When your entire cognitive bandwidth is consumed by figuring out how to afford meat for your family by Friday, your capacity to organize, strategize, and execute a collective long-term political revolution is severely stunted.
That is so dark. The economic misery isn't the catalyst for revolution. The misery is actually the regime's shock absorber.
Exactly. People are simply too tired to revolt.
Wow. But assuming that societal pressure does eventually break the dam, the country enters the transition period. This is the danger zone we mentioned earlier.
The most fragile phase.
Right. It's the chaotic interim between the breakdown of the old regime and the consolidation of new institutions.
It is the absolute danger zone of state development.
Ah.
During this window, institutional uncertainty is at its peak. So to manage this chaos, the prevailing blueprint suggests forming an interim government called a National Reconciliation Council, or NRC.
And this would be a really diverse group, right?
Highly diverse. Around 28 members pulled from incredibly conflicting backgrounds. We're talking monarchists, secular Republicans, reformists, and leaders of ethnic minorities.
And historically, broad coalitions like that in the Iranian opposition have fractured almost immediately, right? Over ideological purity tests or just personality conflicts.
We've seen it happen recently, yeah.
With the collapse of various opposition charters. But the NRC framework proposes a workaround: deferment. The council members have to agree to actively defer the biggest, most explosive question, which is whether Iran becomes a constitutional monarchy or a secular republic to a later nationwide referendum.
Right. They aren't meant to agree on a final ideology right away. They're just meant to provide a legitimate representative umbrella to maintain basic civil order.
It's kind of like remodeling a house. You cannot tear down the load-bearing walls without first putting up a temporary support beam, or the whole roof caves in.
That's a perfect analogy.
The NRC is that temporary support beam. If you start arguing about what color to paint the living room before the ceiling is stabilized, the whole house collapses.
And the historical models totally back that up. If you look at transitional models that succeeded, like in Eastern Europe, versus those that failed catastrophically, like in Libya and Iraq, the primary lesson is the absolute necessity of institutional continuity.
Institutional continuity.
Yeah. To avoid Libya's fate, where the state basically dissolved into warring militias, the new government must preserve the functioning state bureaucracy. You need the mid-level civil servants who actually know how to keep the water running, the lights on, and the hospitals open.
Okay, wait, hold on. Let me push back on this because it seems incredibly risky. The blueprint also suggests keeping the conventional military, the Artesh, intact to serve as the professional core for post-transition security.
Yes, that's a core part of the plan.
But if we keep the traditional military intact to prevent chaos, aren't we just handing the keys right back to the guys with the guns? Like, how do you prevent the Artesh from just establishing a new military dictatorship like we've seen in places like Egypt or Sudan?
Is an inherent risk. Absolutely. But you have to look at the structural incentives. The Artesh, historically, is a national defense force, not an ideological internal security force like the IRGC.
Okay, so their mindset is different.
Very different. And if the transitional government immediately dismantles the military, you suddenly have hundreds of thousands of unemployed, armed men who know how to fight.
Which is exactly what triggered the insurgency in Iraq after the U.S. disbanded the Iraqi army.
Exactly. That's the nightmare scenario. By keeping the Artesh intact, paying their salaries, and respecting their institutional pride, the civilian government binds the military's survival to the success of the new state.
I see.
You give them a monopoly on violence, yes, but you subordinate them strictly to a civilian command structure.
You essentially hire them to guard the transition.
Exactly.
But here's the catch. Even the most perfectly designed interim government is going to collapse if the country is bankrupt. The transitional government needs money to pay those soldiers and those civil servants. So how does the international community's use of economic pressure impact this specific transition phase?
Well, this is where we run into a massive paradox regarding international sanctions. If you look at comprehensive economic sanctions, the ones aimed at just starving a regime of resources, they rarely trigger the democratic transitions they are actually designed to provoke.
Right, and the sources use the comparison to Venezuela, which illustrates this perfectly. Broad sanctions targeting the Venezuelan oil industry caused a massive 75% drop in economic output. Per capita income dropped 72%.
Devastating numbers.
But it completely failed to dislodge the autocratic regime.
Because comprehensive sanctions operate on a flawed assumption. The idea is that if you squeeze the economy hard enough, the people will rise up. But as we discussed with the time horizon, squeezing the economy often just makes the population more desperate and more dependent on the state for survival.
And it actually shifts the balance of power, doesn't it? Wait, so by trying to economically starve the regime, the international community accidentally hands the autocrats a monopoly over the remaining resources.
That is exactly the sanctions paradox.
Yes.
By isolating the formal economy, you inadvertently incentivize domestic corruption. The IRGC, which controls the borders and the private ports, they simply take over the shadow economy.
Because no one else can legally bring things in.
Right. When legal imports of medicine, electronics, or car parts stop, the IRGC smuggles them in and sells them at a massive markup on the black market.
And this brings us to the boneyards, which are incredibly important to understand in this context.
They are. The boneyards are basically charitable trusts. After the 1979 revolution, these foundations were set up to manage the seized assets of the fleeing elites.
Ostensibly to help the poor, right?
Ostensibly, yes.
Yeah.
But over the decades, they have morphed into massive, untaxed corporate conglomerates. They control huge swaths of the real estate, construction, and banking sectors. And the craziest part? They answer only to the supreme leader.
So they operate completely outside the formal government budget.
Completely outside.
So broad sanctions devastate the civilian middle class, while the IRGC and the Bonians just thrive in the dark. And extreme economic isolation also pushes the targeted country into deeper alliances with other sanctioned or autocratic nations like Russia and China, creating this parallel global economy.
Which is why policy architects strongly advocate for a shift toward smart sanctions.
Smart sanctions.
Yeah. Instead of embargoing the entire economy, the strategy shifts to targeting specific individuals responsible for human rights abuses, designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and aggressively tracking their international shell companies.
You cut off the CEO's personal bank account and freeze the shadow networks rather than shutting down the factory floor and firing all the workers?
Precisely. And this has to be paired with a real economic stabilization plan. During the transition period, the new government has to actively dismantle the IRGC's economic conglomerates and the boneyards.
Breaking up those monopolies.
Yes, to foster a truly independent private sector. Because without a thriving independent middle class, a democratic transition simply cannot sustain itself.
That economic independence is basically the foundation for the final architectural blueprint, assuming the interim period is stabilized. The military is integrated, the shadow state is dismantled, and the economy is recovering. What does the new consolidated democracy actually look like?
Well, it has to address the demographic reality of Iran, because the country is a mosaic.
Right. Nearly half of the population belongs to non-Farsi ethnic groups. Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, Arabs. Any permanent constitutional order has to be rooted in the legal principle of internal self-determination.
And internal self-determination means having a voice, cultural rights, and political autonomy within the existing borders of the country.
So not breaking the country apart into separate ethno-states.
Exactly. The international models that researchers point to here are UN-supervised phased transitions like those in Namibia and Kosovo, where the central authority is gradually decentralized.
The framework suggests that Iran might adopt a decentralized unitary state or a federal model. This would provide regional autonomy, allowing local languages to be taught in schools alongside Farsi, and giving provinces administrative power over their own local budgets and resources.
Which is absolutely essential for preventing internal fragmentation. If marginalized ethnic groups feel they finally have a real seat at the table, it massively undercuts the appeal of extremist, separatist narratives.
It's basically ensuring that people in the provinces don't feel like they've just swapped an absolute theocratic dictator in Tehran for an absolute democratic committee in Tehran.
Exactly. They want local control.
They want control over their own lives. Taking the centralized power of the supreme leader and replacing it with a decentralized web of local representative voices, it actually fulfills what many historians call the unfinished project of Iran's 1906 constitutional revolution.
It really does. It's a push for the rule of law and decentralization that has been well over a century in the making.
It is a massive historical continuum, and Piecing together the logistics of this transition is an incredibly delicate puzzle.
It's one of the most complex puzzles in modern geopolitics.
It really is. So, to recap the journey we've taken you on today, we mapped out how the hybrid theocracy is slowly being consumed by its own military arm, the IRGC. We explored how the rentier system and the crushing reality of everyday survival stifle the demographic push for freedom.
Right.
We examined the tightrope walk of the interim period, utilizing a National Reconciliation Council to defer ideological battles, and managing the massive risk of keeping the traditional military intact.
And we unraveled the sanctions paradox, where starving a formal economy just feeds the shadow state.
Exactly. And finally, we looked at the structural blueprint for a decentralized, multi-ethnic representative democracy.
And again, it's worth repeating that charting this path for you today is purely an exercise in understanding geopolitical architecture, not endorsing a political outcome.
Absolutely. We're just the guides. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought. We discussed how stabilizing a new democracy, avoiding a complete institutional collapse often requires keeping parts of the old state bureaucracy and the conventional military intact.
You need the old mid-level managers to keep the lights on.
Right. But this raises an incredibly difficult question about the nature of justice. If you preserve the institutions of the old regime to maintain peace and order, how does a new society achieve true justice for the thousands of victims of that old regime?
It's a huge dilemma. If you don't hold the perpetrators accountable, you betray the victims. But if you aggressively prosecute everyone involved in the old state, you risk triggering an immediate civil war.
Where exactly is the line between national reconciliation and historical impunity? It's something to think about as you watch history unfold.